So, welcome. Here we are with our last topic for the semester. We're going to be talking about economic growth, and we're going to split these notes. So, it's the chapter 10 material. We're going to split these notes into two parts. This part is going to cover the material in sections 1, 2, and 4, where you're going to see a lot of information that we've already discussed this semester being tied together. So, we have already defined standards of living and how we measure economic growth and so forth, but it seems like it's apropos to kind of put it all in one place. And so that's what the focus of this set of notes is. The second set of notes, the analytics of economic growth, is just fancy pants way for saying we're going to do some math. So we're going to take specific functional specification and kind of talk about some of the ideas that we're raising in this set of notes. Earlier, we defined, and I think indeed we probably had this slide in earlier notes, our standard of living as the degree to which people have access to goods and services that make their lives easier, healthier, safer, and more enjoyable. And economic growth refers to a process, literally is referring to changes in the quantity and also quality of goods and services that the economy can produce. So what I want to do first is try to marry these two things together. And so again, we've already talked about this, but it is probably worth our time to say it again. So as you'll see, when we define when we define standards of living, we're going to talk about it as real GDP per person, or real GDP per capita, which is what you see on the vertical axis in this diagram. And then on the horizontal axis, we're just mapping it across time for the US as well as for several other regions in the world. And it's difficult to see, but if you were interested, you could go to the hyperlink that's at the lower right-hand portion of the screen, and is something as well that I'll link into Canvas to see that we in the United States have experienced profound economic growth over the last 200 years. So GDP per person is more than 20 times bigger than it was in 1819. And then that growth hasn't obviously diminished in the last 100 years. We see income per person that's more than 5 times bigger, and then in the last 50 years, more than 2 times bigger. And so what we want to think about ultimately is, why does this happen? But for now, what I want to do is try to remind you of why we look at GDP per capita. So the overarching reason why is that if we think about the sets of ways in which we might define our standard of living, it would probably be reflected in part by some of the things that you see right here. You know, how much education are you able to at least have access to? Life satisfaction, infant mortality, life expectancy, and a whole host of other kinds of things that we would think of as being indicative of our standard of living are themselves correlated with GDP per capita. So you can see the positive relationship between life satisfaction and say life expectancy, and the inverse relationship with GDP per person and infant mortality. So when we think about defining standards of living, what we are going to do is proxy the standard of living by per capita real GDP. And so what I want to do is think a little bit about these sorts of words. It's hard for me to do that without thinking with a pen. So we're going to proxy standard of living by per capita real GDP. So again, real GDP is a measure of income. And when we are looking at a real variable, of course, we're adjusting for the effects of inflation. And we have already commented in many spots that looking at inflation adjusted macroeconomic variables is preferable to looking at their nominal counterparts, because inflation is going to distort our measure. Additionally, we're going to look at per capita real gross domestic product. So per capita is per person. So we're going to take the whole of GDP and we're going to divide it by the population. And so we are going to do that because real GDP is just a measure of the income for the whole economy. But if you were going to think about your standard of living, it would be your share on average, of course, and we'll talk about that towards the end of the next set of notes, but your share of all of the income that's generated in the macroeconomy. So we have a couple of questions that arise from this. One is, to what degree is your standard of living changing? And so when we ask that question, what we're talking about is growth. So when we're talking about growth, what we're looking at here is, again, the percentage change in, of course, real GDP per capita. So the percentage change in real GDP per capita is synonymous with the growth rate of real GDP per capita. So we are asking, to what degree is that changing? That's our fundamental question with economic growth. And then related to that is, what is it that's causing your standard of living and real GDP per capita to be changing? So the final bullet point on this slide is just a reminder that what our focus is in these notes is on the macroeconomy in the long run, and on potential real gross domestic product. So essentially, to take the analogy of that cropped up in the last set of notes and prior, we're asking about what causes the size of the pie to rise. So if we take potential gross domestic product as the overall size of the goods and services that the macroeconomy can produce, what causes that pie to rise and what causes your slice of it as well to go up. So we're going to drop through the rest of these notes the adjective potential because it's implied. When we're talking about the long run and we talk about changes in gross domestic product, the implication is that we're talking about changes in the potential level of gross domestic product. And again, that's in contrast to what we saw in our discussion in chapters 18 through 20, which was focused on the macroeconomy in the short run. In those chapters, we held the potential level of gross domestic product fixed and asked about fluctuations around that. So now we're looking at that underlying trend. So there are some facts that we can identify with economic growth. Four kind of key facts. Three of them are on this slide, and then the next one we'll expound upon. So I have two graphs here as well. The larger graph is showing the real GDP growth rate. Well, let me say that, showing the growth rate of real GDP per capita in various countries relative to the United States. So the United States is the baseline, so it's sitting there as 100. And then we look at the behavior of other countries around that. And then the littler picture is showing in levels. So the big picture is showing growth rates, the little picture is showing levels, real GDP per capita. And so you can see, of course, with either graph that real GDP per capita varies enormously among nations and, of course, among regions of the world as well. The second fact, and one that you see from the littler slide, the one below, is that everybody used to be poor. And beginning at various spots, but roughly speaking, with the Industrial Revolution, some countries and regions really took off and others languished. And then, of course, we can see if we come into if you look, say, for maybe this period, sorry, say from, oh, I don't know, oops, this period on, you can see it's sort of jumbled here, but South Korea is this tan line. You can see this really sharp uptick for South Korea, and as well, really sharp uptick for Japan, leading into, say, the early 1990s, and then sort of a languishing. But within that context, there are growth miracles and there are growth disasters. So, and this is not my terminology, and it's not something that I mean to be particularly pejorative. It's more descriptive than anything else. The profound takeoff by Japan and by South Korea at different points, but there's sharp escalation in growth in real GDP per capita are examples of growth miracles. We could talk about the recent phenomenal growth as well in China, and indeed in many of the not that China is Southeast Asia, but other Southeast Asian countries' economic performances have been similar to these sharp upticks that are observed by Japan and South Korea in the larger picture. And you can see in this littler picture the region of Africa kind of languishing, and the performance of Argentina, particularly since the 1950s and forward. But indeed, Argentina had an economy that was roughly comparable to the United States's in terms of GDP growth rates of GDP per capita. Um, in excuse me, the level of real GDP per capita in the at the turn of the 1900s, the previous century, and through a variety of reasons, the growth rate has really languished. And there are a couple hidden slides in this presentation that follow that show also behavior of growth miracles and growth disasters if you wanted to take a look at those. The other thing that is important to recognize here is that small differences in growth rates can have big effects on GDP per capita. And the reason for this is something that should be familiar to us, and that is the power of compounding, which we'll turn to first, but then we can also see with the rule of 70, which again is something that we looked at previously. So the power of compounding is again the idea that if we were going to think about the future value of some variable, say in year t, it's going to be equal to today's value times 1 plus the growth rate, and that whole thing raised to the power t, where t is some number of years into the future. So we saw this when we talked about growth in gross domestic product earlier, but more recently we saw it when we were talking about interest rates and present values. What I want to do is bring it back to thinking about, and we could do that with interest rates because an interest rate is just the growth rate in an amount of money, which we talked about as well. But what I want to do is consider this specific example that I have in the chart, and then use that to sort of suggest to you why we see in this graph the sharp differences in real GDP per person, despite the fact that as we go over the last couple hundred years, despite the fact that it doesn't seem like 1.6 and 1.4, for instance, are that different, or 1.4 and 1.3 aren't that different. So what is it that leads to these very sharp differences in GDP per capita? So what I want to do in this example is, let's suppose that we have two countries, country A and country B, and that both start initially with income per capita. Sorry, I'll make this trying. Had to use a different software. I couldn't make my presentation download properly. So this is going to be perhaps a little bit of a struggle. But let's suppose that for both of these countries, we start off with income per capita of $1,000, and that's of course real GDP. And what I want to do is remark upon the idea that despite the fact that in country A there's a growth rate of 3%, and in country B we have a growth rate in GDP per capita of 2%, it doesn't seem like that's a big difference. But if we spread this out over a long period of time, then it's going to be quite profound. So, in particular, if we just apply this rule in 1 year, so we would put, of course, in here, this would be 1030 would be equal to 1000 times 1 plus 0.03 raised to the first power. And we do a similar sort of calculation to get the value for country B. The difference, of course, after 1 year is just $10. After 5 years, still doesn't seem like it's very profound. It's only going to be $55 worth of difference. But what happens is that compounding is going to show us the power of growth because economic growth is building on prior growth. So yeah, after 50 years, we see a difference in economic performance that is, almost $1,700. And after 100 years, so yeah, maybe, well, I'm not going to live to 100, but you all might live to 100. So maybe not quite our full lifetimes, but somewhere in between here might span the significant difference we could see over the course of a lifetime if we're fortunate. But we would see here that it's almost $12,000 difference. In 100 years, per capita income is nearly 3 times bigger in country A than in country B, despite the fact that they start off with just 1 percentage point difference in their growth rates. And so we can see this again showing up in the performance for the United States versus some of the other regions of the world. We can also see this by reminding ourselves of the rule of 70. So the rule of 70, let's see if I can insert. So the rule of 70, you might recall, is a kind of rough rule of thumb that told us something about growth, and that is the idea that the average number of years it takes a variable to double. We'll call that variable x for now, to double is given by 70 divided by the growth rate of that variable x. So for country A, we would say that approximately it takes 23 years for real GDP per capita to double. And so again, what does that mean? What that means is that after 23 years, we go from 1,000 to 2,000. After 46 years, we go to 4,000. After 69 years, we go to 8,000. After 92 years, we go to 16,000. And then, of course, we saw that after 100 years, GDP per capita was almost 20 times larger than what it started off with. We saw that right there. Similarly, if we think about country B, You draw exactly the same observations that we had before, but sometimes it's just easier to think about it this way. For country B, we have 70 divided by 2, which is 35 as the approximate number of years. It takes GDP per capita to double. And so again, if we say here's the first 35 years, we go from 1,000 to 2,000, and then we have another 35 years. We're at 4,000, so that's at year 70. Another 35 years takes us actually a little bit longer to year 105 beyond this, and that would be like, according to this rule, around 8,000. And of course, we saw that after 100 years, GDP rose by about 7 times, not the full 8 times. We saw that number up here. And as a result, again, we have the same observation that after 100 years, GDP per capita in country A is almost 3 times bigger than GDP per capita in country B, just because of these relatively small differences in growth rates, but because growth compounds the growth that occurred previously. So we grow and grow and grow based on what was happening previously. What I want to do at this point is to think about how we would measure and understand economic growth. And so we're going to start to introduce some notation, some of which we, of course, seen before, but not necessarily in this particular context. So Y is going to be our notation for real gross domestic product. L is the number of people who are employed. We can also sometimes see this as also done in hours, but we'll typically refer to this in our discussion as just number of people, or you could say worker hours if you wanted. And I'm going to always shorten the population to just pop. So if we wanted to think about what GDP per capita is, so right, this is per capita real GDP, we could divide by L and multiply by L. And what we have then are two pieces. And what I want to do is focus for the first little while on this first piece, or excuse me, on this piece right here, the second piece. Sorry, getting ahead of myself. What is this? This is, of course, the number of people who are employed, or worker hours per population. This is going to mirror something that we've already talked about. It's going to mirror the employment to population ratio. We have to be careful. We have two notions of population in that discussion, which was in the unemployment notes. This is the working age population, which is in the US, individuals who are 16 years and older. Working age population sometimes varies from country to country in terms of how it's defined, but that's how we defined it. And how we do define it in the US. One of the things that I want to think about is that if we're asking what causes increases in per capita real GDP, one place we can look as a driver of increases in per capita real GDP, and by extension our standards of living, is at immigration as a source of growth, and by incorporating more people into the labor force and into jobs. So historically in the US, it's been the case that immigration immigration, as well as incorporating women into the labor force, has historically been a strong driver of economic growth. But it's also the case that in the US, we're seeing some demographic shifts that are coming, that are evident through this channel, that are going to slow economic growth. So we see, because of the aging population in the US, a slowing in the number of people who are employed. In the textbook, there's a reference to the dependency ratio, which is not quite the inverse of this, but certainly as the dependency ratio goes, as the dependency ratio is going up, it's probably the case that we're seeing the number of people who are employed as a fraction of the population going down. So what is the dependency ratio? The authors of the textbook kind of play this fast and loose. The definition in the US, so again, it's going to vary from country to country slightly in terms of in terms of who's counted. But what this is the number of people who are below 16, so therefore not in the working age population, or greater than 65, divided by the number of people who are 16 to 65 years old. So not quite the same kind of labor statistic that we talked about in the unemployment notes, but certainly related. So what you can observe, of course, is that in the US, we have more and more people that are falling into that category, the over 65 cohort, as the baby boomer generation becomes older and older. And as a result, we see the numerator rising, and the denominator, the number of people that are in that cohort, is also shrinking. So one of the things that is limiting the extent to which there can be growth in per capita real GDP is these kinds of demographic effects that are happening. The other thing that I think is important to note with this, before we transition, is that looking at employment as a fraction of the population may not perfectly capture what we want in terms of well-being. So we can also note that there is an imperfect link to really what our big question is, which is well-being. So we're proxying, so per capita real GDP proxies well-being, or our standard of living, imperfectly, and arguing that we should have more people working as a fraction of the population so that we can increase GDP per capita is perhaps missing the boat. It's true numerically that if we have more people working, in other words, if L goes up, then it's going to be the case that, other things equal, income per person is going to go up, but that's not the same thing as saying we should do that. It can be the case that if we have a population that becomes richer, as we have seen in the United States, then they're able to take more leisure. More leisure can correlate with higher levels of well-being, but not, strictly speaking, an increase in GDP per capita. So we need to be careful with this. So leisure would imply, so if more leisure would imply a decrease in L over the population, but that's not necessarily bad in a pejorative sense, in a value judgment sense. The other thing that I want to focus on, and this will motivate in a big way what we consider, especially in the second set of these notes, is that this is bounded by 1. The upper limit of L over the population is numerically 1. We can't have more people working than are in the country itself. Um, so, well, yeah, so as a result, this provides then a hard limit to the extent to which we can see increases in income per capita, at least from this source, which is why, so it limits in the increase, the extent to which we can see an increase in GDP per capita from increasing labor per capita. And this is why we focus on increases in Y over L to increase income per capita. So let me comment on that for a second. So Y over L is output per worker. This is, everything is an average. So this is average labor productivity. So because it is the case that this number really is effectively is bounded by 1, if we want to see increases in our standard, if we want to see increases in per capita real GDP, which proxies improvements in standards of living, we need to think about how we're going to raise labor productivity. So to get increases in real per capita GDP, which is a proxy for standard of living and well-being, we need to figure out how to increase labor productivity. And it is important for you to get that because it sounds sometimes, if you just listen to rhetoric without kind of processing what's happening, it sounds like this is some kind of, capitalistic in the most pejoratively negative way mission to keep workers under their thumb and to just drive people into the ground. So sometimes there probably are people who are thinking about the world that way, but when we think about it through this lens, the only way that we can see sustained increases in our standard of living is if we have sustained increases in output per worker. So to have sustained increases in our standard of living, we need to have sustained increases in labor productivity. Output per worker. There is no other kind of choice. So the big question is, what factors are going to contribute to output per worker? So drives or influences what drives or influences output per worker? That's what we're going to turn to now, and it's going to be what we turn to in a big way in the next set of notes. So now we're going to just add some notation to what we had before. So again, Y is gross domestic product, L is the number of people who are employed, and now we're going to introduce some familiar and some unfamiliar notations. So K is something that we've had floating around before as a notation for physical capital. We're going to also talk for a little bit about human capital, which we've introduced before definitionally, and I'll remind you of the definition as quickly as I can. And then technological progress. And as we're going to see in the next set of notes, this is really the key. Technological progress is the key for having sustained increases in our standards of living. So we'll do the math for that a little bit later, but understanding economic growth then means that we need to understand the factors that drive average labor productivity. So, what can we say more about the levels of human capital, physical capital, and technological progress? Well, I want to remind you again of the definition of human capital. This is the embodied skills and expertise that are acquired from formal education, from on the job training, and from experiences. So, what are some of the things that can influence human capital? Well, obviously, education. And so that's the focus of what's described in the textbook, which is why I reproduce it here. But again, I want to emphasize as well work experiences and other kinds of experiences all get embodied in you. So it is important to recognize that when we're talking about human capital, we're talking about something that is, in a sense, owned by you. So school is important. Preschool and primary school is going to develop literacy. In secondary school, you get a wider swath of knowledge based on your basic literacy skills. And then, of course, in college, what you're doing, presumably, is enhancing your productivity by specializing. So you have already a fairly wide set of skills that are embodied in you, and you're going to find the ones that you like to do the best and that you're best at, and you'll specialize in those through the choice of majors and minors, and then later on career choices. Physical capital. Physical capital is the machinery and plant and roads and other kinds of infrastructure that we have in the economy. Physical capital, of course, again, is the type of goods that are available to produce goods and services into the future. They're long-lived assets. We have noted and can note again that foreign direct investment through net capital inflows is something that can contribute to our physical capital stock. So this is why we said earlier, we can't necessarily say that trade deficits are bad in and of themselves. They just reflect the balance between savings and investment. And so if a country has a lot of investment opportunities, some of that might be fulfilled through foreign direct investment into the economy. Investment depends on the savings rate. This is going to be something that we appeal to when we do the mathematical treatment of growth in the part 2 set of notes. It's also a reminder for what we're going to talk about in terms of policy, that savings is important as a driver of long-run economic growth. And then in the textbook, there is the question of what does capital do vis-a-vis labor? The authors just have this blanket statement: physical capital is a complement to labor. Historically, unquestionably, that's true. If we look at the broad swath of economic history and its and improvements in our standards of living, Where capital has displaced workers, by and large, workers have adapted, maybe not in the first generation, or it may have taken some time, but the economy has vastly improved as a result of that. And the quintessential example of this is agriculture. If we think about a country like the United States at the turn, at the coming into the 1900s, there was 20% or more of the population that was engaged in agriculture, probably more than that. Now it's below 2%. So what happened? Obviously capital has displaced hard physical labor on farms, but what that has done is freed up the opportunity for people that were doing that very physically demanding work to pursue other activities that have higher value to the economy. I think, though, that the statement of physical capital as a complement to labor as a truism for everything is a little hopelessly naive and Pollyannish, and it's something that I want to come back to at the end of the next set of notes when we're kind of wrapping up and thinking about summarizing for the semester. So then we saw, of course, that that we have labor, human capital, physical capital, and A standing for technology. So technological progress is this variable that we'll have in our equations later on that we'll denote with an A. This refers to new ideas. So I think technological progress, if you think about it as ideas, can be a really helpful way to think about it. We tend to think about technological progress as literally being the computer, but the computer is an embodiment of technological progress. I think it was interesting in the textbook that the authors were like, yeah, computer chips, silicon, sand. We've had sand for a long time, but it took really clever people to figure out how to move from building sand castles to building computers. And that's what we mean by technological progress. We're looking at new ideas, new methods for repurposing and using existing resources, or new ideas about how to develop even more resources. So far, our discussion has been on what we refer to in growth literature as the proximate causes of growth. So physical capital, human capital, and technology. But what when you start to think about this, and you kind of get a little meta and say, well, what factors determine whether people will invent new ideas or whether they'll invest in human or physical capital? And when we do that, then we go back to fundamental causes or fundamental sources of economic growth. And we can put in here three, one of which we're going to emphasize in the remainder of these notes. So geography, this can include land. So when we think about our factors of production, we often will say, oh, the factors of production are land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. We can lump land in here because that's something that we think of as being fundamental to the physical location of the country. In here as well, we might consider climate and obviously the natural resources. So demographers will spend geographic demographers will spend some of their research effort looking at the role that geography is playing in economic growth. Similarly, culture is extraordinarily important in terms of economic growth. So our friends in anthropology and in sociology will often have researchers that are looking at the role of culture and norms as things that are driving economic growth. As economists, we look at those things, but more often the emphasis when we're looking at fundamental causes of growth is on institutions and incentives. And this, before we talk about the definition in a formal sense, I want to say that it matters. And the quintessential example of why and how, well, not why it matters, but how it matters, can be illustrated by looking at the Korean Peninsula. So if you think about North and South Korea before the Korean War, you had the whole peninsula shared similar culture. The geography isn't vastly dissimilar between the north and the south. I mean, mountains, yeah, but nonetheless, it's not a dissimilar geography. And yet, when we look at um, the North and South Korean peninsula by night, you can see the phenomenal difference in terms of development by just looking at light. So in North Korea, it is largely devoid of ambient light at night, and in South Korea, it's lit up like no other. And so this is I think a useful way of thinking about the role of institutions and incentives and why they're so important in terms of economic development. So, what do we mean by this? Institutions, for example, government stability, but we have the institutions listed below, are the foundation because they provide the incentives that guide people's decision making regarding the invention of new ideas or guiding their decisions about whether to undertake investment in human capital or in physical capital. And there are a number of key institutions that promote economic growth. And we have talked about these before. So we talked about these in the overview to macroeconomic notes back in week 4. And in fact, I think that probably lifted these slides from that. So there are 3 or 4, depending on how you want to think about it, key institutions that promote economic growth: property rights, stable government, efficient regulation, and then well-designed government policies. So by property rights, and again, there's a great description of these things in the textbook, so I don't want to dwell too long here. Property rights means, if there are property rights, it means that you can control the resources and you can claim ownership. So you can buy or sell the resources that are your own. Without property rights, there's little incentive, maybe no is too extreme, but little incentive to undertake wealth building. And I'll have a podcast that I link into Canvas, because what am I if not the podcast queen, right? That you might find quite thought provoking in this regard. A stable government also makes economic growth more likely. If a government has corruption, or if there is concern that the government is going to appropriate the profits of a company or just take over a company altogether, that can create disincentives towards investment and innovation. With regulation, there is again a discussion of this that's pretty robust in the textbook. The easier it is to start businesses, and the less, let me say, excessive regulatory oversight, the more likely it is that economic growth is going to be robust. So excessive is pretty value laden term. What I might consider excessive, you might not, and vice versa. So I guess it's in the eye of the beholder, but you can certainly look at measures like how long does it take to start a business, to go through the paperwork to start a business, as one indication of the degree of regulatory oversight in a bad way if it's long, in a favorable way if it's short. Now, I want to go on record saying I think there's lots of regulation that the government does that is fantabulous, and that there should be more of it. So this is fairly nuanced. But what we're talking about here are things that impede savings and investment decisions and new business startup in a way that doesn't seem warranted. And then finally, well-designed government policies. These government policies have got to do two things. They have to maintain these other institutions. So, well-designed policies that are consistent with efficient regulation, maintenance of property rights, and government stability, and those that encourage innovation by creating incentives or excuse me, creating incentives through intellectual property laws like patents and copyrights. Again, you can read about this in the textbook, and I think get a pretty good sense of this. But basically, the idea would be that you're going to encourage innovation and encourage investment when it is the case that, at least for a temporary period of time, the benefits of your efforts are going to accrue to you and not just be immediately stolen by used by a rival company. And then the second way in which governments can encourage innovation is to subsidize research and development, and we'll see this mentioned on the final slide. So, in concert with this, I want to think about what governments can do to promote long run economic growth. So, what do we mean by these well designed policies? So, creating incentives through intellectual property laws, fine, but what else? Well, we've talked about monetary policy and fiscal policy, so let's round this out with an eye towards promoting long run economic growth. Again, essentially, what we're talking about is in what way can policies be created that enhance the incentives to acquire more human capital or physical capital, or affect positively the policies that encourage innovation. So, monetary policy. The most obvious way in which monetary policy can be crafted with an eye towards long run economic growth is to have a credible commitment to long run inflation stability. Why is that? Well, that's because if everybody believes that the central bank is going to promote a stable and well articulated rate of inflation, then that's going to be the one that we come to expect. And if that's the one that's expected, then this is going to promote financial market stability. We saw way back when we were talking about inflation, that when inflation is unanticipated, it can introduce involuntary redistribution of income and wealth between borrowers and lenders. And as a result, that can destroy or certainly mitigate the extent to which investment is undertaken. And similarly, just more generally, if inflation is stable, then that's going to mean that the real reward, real profits, real returns from investment and from saving are going to be maintained. In other words, purchasing power is going to be maintained, and that will also provide a stronger incentive for undertaking investment. For fiscal policy, we've talked about this most recently in the last set of notes. What can governments do to promote long run economic growth? Well, perhaps some supply side policies, as we talked about them before, so tax policies. And I didn't mention then, but we can add now as well, tax code simplification could fall into this bucket of supply side tax policies. Um, So what are these? These would be tax cuts to encourage savings and investment along the lines of what we saw in the previous set of notes, subject to, of course, the comments that we raised as well in the previous set of notes. So there are distributional implications or consequences. Who's going to get these tax cuts? Firms and relatively rich people, and that may exacerbate inequality in the short run and not be something that we're willing to tolerate. So it is a balancing act between the short run and the long run. Similarly, there's some debate as to whether these tax policies, as we kind of think about them, have a significant impact on investment, and if they do, whether that in turn has a strong impact on long run economic growth. So, what we can tend to argue, perhaps not surprisingly, is that if we target tax policies as opposed to just, all corporations, high and low, have a lower marginal tax rate, maybe you target particular types of endeavors through um, tax credits or like in particular investment tax credits, that might be more impactful. The other thing that we're going to see in the next set of notes is that, sure, if we increase investment, then that should increase the capital stock. But if we're a country like the United States, where we already have a lot of physical capital, then it's less likely to contribute to sustained, well, it's not going to contribute to sustained long run economic improvements in our standard of living. And the same thing can be true for human capital. We will see this in the next set of notes, and it turns on the concept of diminishing returns. And this is why we tend to think about the role of government in this regard as being particularly focused on efforts that foster research and development. So, to the extent that this correlates with new ideas, and we'll see that new ideas themselves are not likely subject to diminishing returns, this is something that we strongly tend to advocate for public policy. On the supply side, with spending, we can think about infrastructure spending, again, increasing the capital stock, education spending, job retraining programs, anything that the government might do to make the level of full employment higher or full unemployment lower. We can think about labor market programs broadly defined. So this could include anti-discrimination policies, minimum wage legislation to the extent that income support can encourage greater productivity. We can think about healthcare in this bucket as well. So a lot of it is just going to turn on how big a government does a country want, and how big a role government should play in our day-to-day lives. We again can talk about spending on basic research and development, so say funding the National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation. Sometimes people will focus as well on military spending on the premise that, at least historically, a lot of very interesting applicable new ideas have come out of spending on military research and development. And then finally, with respect to fiscal policy, we talked in the last set of notes about budget deficits and debts. The final thing that governments can do in this regard is to maintain a credible commitment to maintaining sustainable levels of budget deficits and debt as a percent of GDP in order to minimize the likelihood of a debt crisis or a crisis of confidence. Again, probably not yet anyway, a concern for the United States and many other developed economies, but certainly something that would be relevant for a developing country. So in the next set of notes, what we're going to do is to expound on this with some math, and then conclude, kind of circle back around to some of the policy choices that we're talking about now.